Welcome back to our study of 1 Corinthians. This is the second session where we talk about chapters 4 and 5 of the study, of the letter, So this is from theologian N.T. Wright, who I really like a lot. This is what he says about as an introduction to these chapters. Some religious systems try to make out that the world isn't so bad after all, or alternatively that what we perceive as evil is just an illusion. In Judaism and Christianity, the world is God's good and lovely world, and evil is a real, powerful, and horrible intruder into it. Sooner or later, God must and will put it right. Believing in God's final judgment is part of believing that God is the good and wise creator, and that his kingdom will one day come on earth as in heaven. But it's very tempting for people to want to put everything right and to pay off what they see as old scores ahead of time. We think we know what God should do, and we're eager to give him advice. I think that sounds about right, doesn't it? And he says the Corinthians seem to think that their new status in Christ, coupled with the wisdom that they think they have in the world's eyes, gives them the right to pass judgment on people, including Paul himself. And if you recall from last week's discussion, wisdom and knowledge was huge for that community. So their wisdom that they think they now have was leading them to be more judgmental of other people and not looking at their own behavior at all, really. So we started with reading chapter 4, verses 1 through 21. And then we talked about judgment because Paul is criticizing them for judging other people and how they're treating others. And so one of the questions we talked about was, what or whom do you wish God would judge now rather than waiting for some future day of judgment? And I think every single one of us found someone or some group or something that we would like God to judge, because I think that's human nature. We want justice and we want to see evil punished and we want to see bad behavior, people held accountable. And if the world isn't doing that, someone needs to do it, and it should be God's job to do that. But we want to be able to tell God who we think should be judged. It certainly shouldn't be us, though, right? It's always somebody else. But that's some of the danger of that, though. That we judge other people, but we're not willing to look at ourselves. And one of the other questions was why might God's judgment be delayed? And so we talked a little bit about why God doesn't rain down punishment on people or groups that are evil, people who commit genocide and evil rulers and terrorists and things like that. But even just individual people that commit crimes and things, why doesn't God punish them? And so we spent some time talking about some of those things. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on that and what you think. And why do you think God's judgment is delayed and why God doesn't judge us? I think that would be really interesting. And so again, to talk about why we should be careful about not pointing out things in other people and being so quick to criticize other people. One of the scriptures that I talked about was the one where Jesus says, we're so quick and it's so easy to point out the splinter in someone else's eye, but we don't see the log in our own eye. And that's one of the dangers of that. We think we can judge other people, but we don't deserve to be judged, right? So that is a dangerous place to be in. Another interesting thing that N.T. Wright talked about that I thought was really interesting in that passage in chapter 4, if you look back at verse 9, Paul is referring to, and the people hearing this letter read would have understood this right away. It's not something that we would hear, but this theologian says that Paul draws this picture of a Roman general returning to a city after winning this great victory. And the Roman army would march in parade and celebration in the streets and pass under this triumphal arch and carrying all the plunder that they would have brought back with them from these conquering these other people. And they would have brought back the prisoners of war, the prisoners that they brought back with them, of the people they conquered. And those people would come at the back of the procession. They always brought up the tail end of this procession. And at the end of this day of celebration, they would often kill the prisoners in a very celebratory way. I mean, this was not quietly done. This was a celebration of killing your enemies. Or they would be, if they weren't killed, they would be sold off into slavery. And Paul is saying that he and the other leaders of the church in Corinth are also the ones being brought up in the back of this parade. That they are the ones, and we are the ones who are being killed and being enslaved, but in a good way, because we are slaves to Christ. And to put away all the other masters that we have, because when you're a slave, you always have a master. But to put away the other masters in our lives, whether it's money or power or prestige, or I have the best house or the biggest, nicest car or whatever, that we're slaves to Christ, and especially as the leadership in the community, we're to place ourselves at the end, not in the front of the parade. We're the last and the least, as Jesus talked about. And one of the questions in this study is, if Paul needed to make this point to the Christians in Corinth, what do you think he would say to comfortable Western Christians today? I think it's a great question, because I think some of the people in the study during the class said, I think he would be a little more harsh with us than he even was with the Corinthians, because we do sometimes forget. We forget to be humble, and we forget to serve. We want to be the ones being served, and we don't want to serve sometimes. We want to be in the front of the parade, and we don't want to be in the back, and we don't want to be called servants. But that's what Jesus calls us to be. We're supposed to serve. That's what we're called to do as his children. We don't always like that, though. So that was an interesting discussion. And then we read chapter 5, which is challenging. So I encourage you to make sure you read that as you go through this. And one scholar says, although it is a doctrine that we are saved by grace through faith, we must not forget that true gospel grace actually transforms us. Thus, in our passage, Paul is very concerned that the Corinthians vigilantly protect and purify their community by confronting and excommunicating an unrepentant sinner. In other words, moral permissiveness is not grace. In fact, the unity of the body of Christ is cultivated by godly purity maintained through church discipline. So the issue presented here by Paul is that there's a man in the congregation who is living with his stepmother and having a sexual relationship with her. And his concern is that this is openly known in the community and nobody cares. Everybody thinks it's perfectly fine for this man to be sleeping with his stepmother. No one is chastising him or condemning him or well, one of the funny things I found in this, and everybody in the class found this amusing, that in chapter 4 he just got done telling us not to judge people, and in chapter 5 he's saying we need to judge people. So it's kind of a weird, how could he change his mind so rapidly, right? But in this instance, this is a major issue for Paul, and it deserves some discipline by the church body, by the community. And we talked a lot about, this is a very difficult passage, I think, a difficult chapter, because there is discipline, and he talks about excommunication, and he talks about, judging, and all this is difficult stuff. One of the things I personally think, Paul is urging the church to take such drastic and extreme disciplinary measures against this particular man. And I think it's because, at least partly, I think it's really because this is a new community in this town of Corinth, new Christian community. They haven't been around very long, just a couple of years. And again, if you remember, the community that they're in was very much a pagan community with a variety of different religious cults, and a lot of them had a sexual component to them. And one of the issues that was facing this community is that they didn't want to give some of that up. And they wanted to continue to do the things that they wanted to do, regardless of what Jesus is calling us to do, to be a different kind of community. And so Paul is really strict and harsh with them, I think, because he's trying to get them to separate themselves from the culture that they were in, so that they would see themselves as set apart and different than the other religions. That what's acceptable in some of these other religions is not acceptable for Christians. And they really had to kind of make that harsh line, that dividing line of, this is not acceptable behavior anymore. And you really, part of being a Christian is saying, I'm going to stop doing those things. And Paul really had to set that straight with them, and to get them to set themselves apart as a community, so they wouldn't be so tied to the cult of the rest of the community, even though it seems harsh. But I think that's part of it. And other people had other ideas too, which were all good and interesting, because something someone talked about how we talk, one of two of the questions that are important for this section is, what harm is done to a church body when they tolerate open sin among their members? And then the flip side, what harm is done to the church body when they excommunicate a member? So we spent a lot of time talking about that, because these are hard questions. How do you tolerate open sin? And people said, well, it could contaminate the rest of the community, where if people are acting sinfully and nobody says anything, the leadership doesn't do anything, then clearly anyone can do anything and it doesn't matter. So you lose your sense of separateness as a Christian community. But then the other side of that is, we're all sinners, and so if we excommunicate anyone who's sinning, we're all going to be thrown out of the church, pastors included. So there has to be some sort of there's a fine line, I think, there, of grace and responsibility for who you are as a Christian, but to also hold people accountable in love. That I said I can't imagine ever denying communion to someone because they're sinning, because then we'd have to deny it to everybody. That's God's grace in action. And if you're deep in sin, like this gentleman was in this story, if you're that deep in sin, you need Christ's body and blood more than ever to assure you of his love for you. And I don't know, I've never excommunicated anybody. I don't know, I can't imagine doing that, but because to me, if you're in that much pain and you're committing those kinds of sins, you need the support and love of your community more than ever. So throwing them out and separating them from God is not the answer. But we spent a good deal of time talking about that. So I would love to hear your thoughts on what you think about how to deal with sin in the community and excommunication, and how, what you think about all that. Paul also talked about leaven of the old life, and that we need to, to remember that a little bit of yeast, leavens the whole batch, in meaning, again, that the kind of behaviors that the pagans, that the community were involved in, are not acceptable. And it's easy to let those things kind of sneak back in if you're not vigilant about maintaining those lines of separation. But that kind of discipline idea, one of the questions was, how are the churches in Western world likely to respond to engaging in this kind of discipline that Paul describes? I think we'd have a difficult time with it, I think. And then we did talk about the statement, moral permissiveness is not grace. So how do you deal with the world and our culture, the way we live in it now, without condemning and excommunicating much of the congregation? Because we all sin. Again, we all sin. And sexual sin is different now than it was then. It just is, because of the culture we're in. So, how do you manage that, and how do you live with that and work with that in a community of faith? So these were all, it was a very interesting study this time, with some difficult stuff, difficult passages about how do you judge and not judge, and welcome, and but also, you know, be critical in love and support people in their sin, because we all sin. Again, Jesus was the only one who didn't. So I am glad that you joined me again for this video, and please leave your comments. I would love to hear what you have to say and what you think about all of these things. So next time we'll be talking about chapters 6 and 7, so feel free to read ahead into those. And thank you again, and blessings on your day.